I want to feel clean. I mean, who really likes feeling dirty? Who likes dealing with an unclean conscience? Who likes to deal with rumbling regrets and monstrous memories? No one does. I was thinking about this yesterday and thinking, I want to feel clean. Like one day in my life, even a small portion of a day in my life, I just want to feel clean. I mean, who likes to remember the cruel things we've said to our spouse or our children when we're angry, the things we've done and thought in secret? We've concluded that the secret to happiness is self-approval. And so we inescapably create a romantic view of ourselves that downplays the ugliness of our heart, our arrogance, our selfishness, our anger problems, our lust, our greed. We're battling these things all the time. We want to escape from these things. We want to think better of ourselves than what these things actually reveal about us and about our hearts. And so we not only work to hide the worst parts of us from others. I think most of us could agree that we do that. We don't want other people to see the worst parts of us, and so we work to hide those parts of us from others. But we don't just do that. We work to hide the worst parts of us from ourselves. We spend our lives actually trying to hide the worst parts of us from ourselves. And as I said a few weeks ago, we desperately need to think better of ourselves than we actually are. That's a survival instinct that no one has to teach us. I mean, no one has to teach us to do this. We do it naturally. We do it unconsciously. We've been covering our nakedness with fig leaves of our own making since we came into this world. No one has to teach us to do this stuff. No one has to teach us to hide from God, hide from others, hide from ourselves. We are ashamed at the deepest part of our being regarding who we are. And to the degree that you're not, or that you don't feel dirty, or that you don't feel like you have an unclean conscience, to that degree is the degree to which you're hiding from yourself. Because all of us are far worse than we think we are, and we're embarrassed even when we think about the thoughts that go through our minds and the way that we talk to other drivers when we're driving to church and we're late on Sunday morning when no one else is in the car. It's amazing. It's amazing how we not only hide from the worst parts of ourselves from other people, but if you really, I've been literally thinking about this for 3 days. I was at dinner on Friday night with a couple friends and actually talking about this, just how unconsciously, how inescapably we hide the worst parts of ourselves from ourselves. We work so diligently to believe about ourselves something that is better than what is actually true, which is why one psychologist said, I could dismiss half my patients tomorrow if I could just assure them of their forgiveness. It's an amazing statement. I could dismiss half my patients tomorrow if I could just simply assure them that they're forgiven. If I could just assure them of their forgiveness. In other words, we all long for cleanness. We fight for it. We claw for it. We long for it. Well, in these verses, God visits Peter in a vision, and in this vision, God shows Peter that he's much more inclusive and gracious than even Peter thinks he is. I mean, Peter, because of what he's been through, promising to be by Jesus' side no matter what, come hell or high water, and Jesus predicting that Peter would deny Jesus 3 times before the night was even over, and Peter saying, there's no way. There's no way. I mean, you're right on just about everything, you're wrong on that one. And no more than a few hours later, Peter finds himself denying that he even knows Jesus 3 times, and he runs out of the temple courtyard and he weeps bitterly. and has to deal with that for a few days while Jesus lies in the grave. And then Jesus is resurrected from the dead and meets Peter on the beach one morning and assures him that he is not only forgiven, but then commissions him to go and bring the gospel of grace to the ends of the earth. And so Peter knows something of God's grace. He knows something about the radicality of God's forgiveness and just how restoring God is. He knows something about God's love and all of those things. But surely there are limits to God's grace. I mean, Peter is wrestling with the radicality of God's grace in this passage. I mean, we believe God to be gracious, but surely his grace doesn't extend to him or to her. I mean, God's grace does have a ceiling, doesn't it? Well, God is setting up a meeting between Peter, the Jew, and Cornelius, the Gentile, and he wants Peter to know that his reach of grace pushes the envelope, that it includes people that Peter would never imagine in 1,000 years that it could possibly include. And he tells Peter, he introduces this idea that his grace pushes the envelope in a way that is far beyond anything Peter could even imagine. He introduces this idea by giving Peter this vision, and he tells Peter to eat what had always been considered by the law unclean food. So he gives him this vision of what, according to the Old Testament law, was unclean food, and Peter's hungry. He's on the rooftop waiting for dinner to be served. It's being made downstairs, and he's on the rooftop, and he falls into this trance. God causes him to fall into this trance, and he gives Peter this vision where all of this unclean food is coming out of heaven, and he hears a voice from heaven saying, "Peter, I know you're hungry. Kill this and eat this." And it just blows Peter's mind. And this is what he says. He's totally taken aback, and in typical Peter fashion, see, we never fully get away from the worst parts about us. I mean, Peter's learned. He's learned. And we'll see later on that he has to learn even again, which is why I said last week, the bad, forgetful people of the Bible encourage me the most. They just encourage me the most because I look at Peter, I'm like, after all you've been through? I mean, literally, after all that you've been through. I mean, you went through this heinous experience of denying Jesus, and the way you felt as a result of doing that, you felt horrible. You felt just completely terrible about that. And then Jesus, because he's so amazingly gracious, restores you and forgives you and assures you that he's not holding that sin against you. And then you go off and you preach the gospel of grace in some remarkable and powerful ways. But you still don't get it. You get it, but you don't get it, because look at how he responds. I mean, God gives him this vision and says, eat this food, which has always been deemed unclean by the law. And Peter is taken aback, and in typical Peter fashion, he responds with his own resume of righteousness. Look at what he says. "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." Never. Reminds me of Jesus at the Last Supper, going around the table and washing his disciples' feet, and gets to Peter, and Peter goes, "Never. I would never in a million years allow you to wash my feet." And he goes from one extreme to the other, because then Jesus says, "Well, if I don't wash your feet, you can have no part of me." And then Peter responds in another extremist way, "Well, then wash all of me," you know? I mean, he's just always saying things that encourage me, okay? Because they're so dumb, and reveals that he just still doesn't get it. And so he says, "By no means, Lord. For I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean." And notice how God responds. He responds immediately and says, "What I have made clean, don't call unclean. What I have called clean." This is a key verse in the Bible to me, an absolutely key verse. You may just read right past it, as I did for years, but I meditated on this verse a long time yesterday and the day before, and I thought that is a theologically packed verse that promises amazing freedom, and in a sense kind of teaches us how to read the Bible, believe it or not. God says, do not call unclean what I have called clean. Do not call unclean what I have called clean. You see, verse 17, which I read, tells us that Peter is perplexed by God's response. It went against everything he knew. Everything he knew. Peter's statement reveals that at some level he was still banking on his law keeping to make him feel clean. I've never eaten anything that is unclean. By no means, Lord. There's no way I'm going to eat this stuff, because I have never, ever in my life eaten anything that is unclean. When he says that, he reveals that at some level he was still banking on his law keeping to make him feel clean and pure. You see, this is not just true of him, but it's true of us. Like Peter, we may say we believe that we are justified by grace, but we operate as if we believe we are justified by works. Okay, so we may say theologically, we believe in justification by grace alone, that our works cannot gain God's favor. That's impossible. We may say that, but functionally, the way we live reveals, as it did with Peter, reveals that we operate as if we believe we are justified by works. And as I've said before, the gospel isn't some app that we add onto our old operating system. It's a brand new operating system. I was thinking about that a lot this week because I lost my phone. Like, I didn't lose it, but it crashed. And I went for 2 days without a phone. 2 days. And it's unbelievable. I mean, do you know we are all slaves? Okay, I'm here to tell you we are slaves. We are absolute slaves. And the slave master of the 21st century is the iPhone, okay? And we are the slaves. It's unbelievable to me. I mean, it was like I was going through detox. It was unbelievable. I felt a fever coming on. I felt completely disconnected from the outside world. I felt like a hermit that was living in a tent and completely clueless as to what was going on. I lost touch with myself. I didn't even know who I was anymore. It was unbelievable, okay? Anyway, so I was thinking about technology, which is why it's back now, by the way. Vinny Caesar, who is our IT guy here and does a lot of other things, we should vote for him for president should he run, because he fixed me up. So thank you, Vinny, who just recently got married, by the way. Congratulations to Vinny. He and his wife just got back from their honeymoon on Friday. But the gospel, and this is the way we treat it, it's not some app that we add on to our old operating system. It's a brand new operating system. Okay, it's a brand new operating system. So it's not like you can take the radicality and unconditionality of grace and just sort of add it onto our conditional operating system. We think it's sort of just an add-on. It's something else. We have lots of apps, and the gospel just happens to be one of them. But it doesn't work that way. And Peter, in a sense, reveals that for him, at some level, the gospel was an app, not an operating system. Because he reveals that he's still sort of banking on his own sense of purity as a result of keeping the law to make him feel clean and righteous. Which is why, as soon as God says, eat this, he says, no. Let me show you my righteousness. To God, let me show you. We do this all the time. All the time. You know, we feel like if we raise our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, that when they grow old, they will not depart from the faith. And then your kid goes off the deep end and we say, God, I did my part. You have failed to do your part. Okay, we are constantly, whether we realize it or not, we are constantly keeping ledgers. We do things because we think that if we do the right thing, God will owe us. He has to keep up his end of the bargain because we've kept up our end of the bargain. And so Peter says, by no means, here's my resume of righteousness. I won't eat that stuff. because I've never put unclean stuff in my mouth. The law said don't do it, so I didn't do it. I've never done that. There's no way that I could eat this. This is why Peter was perplexed. This new idea that what was previously unclean, God now calls clean, didn't fit into Peter's operating system. Just didn't fit. The notion that God would call something clean that was unclean made no sense to Peter, and it makes no sense to us either. It's counterintuitive. This idea that God would call clean what has always been deemed unclean made no sense to him, and it makes no sense to us. But that's the gospel. The Bible makes it clear. The whore is made a bride. The unrighteous are called righteous. Slaves are made sons. The guilty are forgiven. Sinners are saved. I mean, the logic of law makes sense to us. The logic of grace, on the other hand, makes no sense at all. Grace feels risky. It feels unfair. It turns everything that makes sense to us upside down. Like Job's friends, we naturally conclude that good people get good stuff and bad people get bad stuff. The idea that bad people get good stuff seems crazy. Okay, it offends our deepest sense of justice and rightness. The idea that the bad get the best and the worst inherit the wealth doesn't fit our operating system. Okay, it just doesn't fit. I mean, we live in a conditional world and we are conditional people, and so the logic of law makes sense. You get good grades, you get into a good school. You get into a good school, you do well, you get a good job. You get a good job, you get a good wife. You get a good wife, you get good kids. You get good kids, you get good grandkids. You get good grandkids, you get a good life. If you don't smoke or drink, you won't get cancer. I mean, we live in just a world where conditionality makes sense. Okay, that's the way our world works. But what oftentimes happens is we impose the way this world works, our fallen world works, onto how God works. And so I've told you before that I've shared these things. I remember sharing this idea of the radicality of God's grace to a group of well-known, well-to-do business people a number of years ago, and some guy came up to me afterwards and said, buddy, this stuff just doesn't work in the real world. And he looked at me like I was young and very inexperienced, and I was an idealist, and I didn't really know what I was talking about, and so he said, this stuff just doesn't work in the real world. And I said, well, maybe it's because grace isn't from this world. That's why it doesn't make sense, because it intrudes, this unconditionality intrudes into our conditional framework, and it just starts throwing everything off. And things that used to make sense simply don't make sense anymore. And we would choose, if you remember, Les Mis, amazing, okay? There is probably no bit of literature in the history of Western literature that depicts in story form the idea of law and grace better than Les Mis. And if you remember Javert, who is the lawman, who is spends his life going after Jean Valjean, who has been radically transformed by God's grace. He keeps going out. He's addicted. Javert is just addicted to law. The logic of law makes sense. And every time he goes after Jean Valjean forgives him. He forgives him. He just extends grace upon grace upon grace to someone who just doesn't deserve it. And at the end of the book or the movie, Javert ends up killing himself because he chooses death over chaos, because in his mind, grace just doesn't make sense. It throws off everything that he understands the world to be. He's built his whole life on being a law keeper, an abider of the law, a law enforcer. And now he has encountered someone who is just giving grace upon grace upon grace, and it doesn't make sense to him. He can't live with himself if the way he has lived according to law isn't the way the world actually is, and so he kills himself. Well, we oftentimes make the same mistake. I mean, this just doesn't make sense to us. The idea that the bad get the best and the worst inherit the wealth, which is the gospel, just doesn't fit our operating system. And so God uses this vision to ready Peter for his meeting with Cornelius. Now, Cornelius, as I read, was a Gentile, a non-Jew. Okay, and in those days, what that meant was he didn't grow up going to church. He didn't have a religious background. He didn't go to Christian schools. According to the law, he was unclean. He was unclean. His family was unclean. He had been eating unclean food his whole life. I mean, he was the embodiment of uncleanness. But God was moving in Cornelius and his family, and so he sends Peter to preach the gospel to them. Look at what it says in verse 23. So he invited them in to be his guests. The next day he rose and went away with them, and some of the brothers from Joppa accompanied him. And on the following day they entered Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. When Peter entered, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshiped him. But Peter lifted him up, saying, "Stand up, I too am a man." And as he talked with him, he went in and found many persons gathered. And he said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. I asked then why you sent for me." Okay, so Peter goes. He goes as a result of God's call, and God has told Cornelius and his family, I'm sending someone. There, Cornelius and his family are kind of doing what they know, you know? I mean, they're like, I'm trying, I think there's a God, and if there is, I'm trying to serve him, and the only thing that makes sense is to sort of offer sacrifices and alms and, you know, that sort of thing. And God essentially says, I got something way better for you, Cornelius. I'm going to send Peter to go tell you what that something is. Okay, so he goes and he sends Peter to Cornelius, and you can picture the scene. Cornelius is excited about this, and so he gathers all of his family and his relatives, and he goes in. Peter walks in, and he begins to preach. And beginning in verse 38, it says, this is Peter preaching now. God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. And we are witnesses of all that he did, both in the country of the Jews and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him on the third day and made him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who had been chosen by God as witnesses, who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And he commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one appointed by God to be the judge of the living and the dead. To him all the prophets bear witness that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name. He preaches the gospel. So the almsgiving can stop, okay? Cornelius, there was one who came and paid your debt so that you never have to give alms to God again to appease him. He preaches this amazing gospel, and this is the good news that Cornelius has been waiting to hear, and he and his whole family believes, and they get baptized. Well, this blows everybody away. I mean, you got to understand, back then, the Jewish people back then were still thinking that Jesus was for them, only them. So this idea that Jesus wasn't just for one tribe and one nation, but many tribes and many nations, not just one people group, but lots and lots of different people groups. This was just mind-blowing. Look at verse 44. So while Peter was still saying these things, the Holy Spirit fell on all who heard the word. And the believers from among the circumcised, that is the the Jewish people, the believers from among the circumcised who had come with Peter were amazed because the gift of the Holy Spirit was poured out even on the Gentiles. They were blown away. I mean, this is shattering all of their comfortable categories regarding God's grace and who it intends to reach. Well, hold on a second. I understand that God's grace can reach this person, but that person? I can understand that God's grace can reach this group, but that group? They go on, verse 46, for they were hearing them speaking in tongues and extolling God. Then Peter declared, can anyone withhold water for baptizing these people who have received the Holy Spirit just as we have? And he commanded them to be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, and they asked him to remain for some days. Well, the response of Peter initially and the people who went with Peter to what's happening here is just mind-blowing. I mean, they're like, what in the world is going on? This thing that God is up to is apparently much, much bigger and much, much more inclusive than we ever thought it was. This thing includes people that, quite frankly, we'd rather not be included. This thing includes people that we would have never imagined would possibly be included. I mean, the extent of God's grace is far wider than they realized. The work of God's grace really is a global work that encompasses nothing but uncleanness, because uncleanness is all that there is. And that's part of what was blowing their minds. Well, this reminds me, I was going over this again last night, and my mind once again, as it often is, was brought back to the story of the Good Samaritan, which, as you know, the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man is walking down the road when he's mugged and robbed and beaten and left for dead, and as he lies in the ditch, two people who you would think would help him, a priest and a Levite, they pass by on the other side of the street because they don't want to get their hands dirty. This is one of them, They don't want to get their hands dirty. It's actually the hated half-breed, a Samaritan, who comes to the man's aid, setting him on his donkey, taking him to an inn, paying the innkeeper to take care of him, and promising to return to see that his needs are attended to. That's the story in a nutshell. Now, we read that story, and we think that the whole point of it is to inspire us to be like the Good Samaritan. Be like the Good Samaritan. Help the person in the ditch. Okay, be the Good Samaritan. If you read that story in context, that's not at all what's going on. Jesus tells that story in response to a lawyer's question who says, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus paints this picture of impossibility and says, well, just this is what you need to do. It's like the rich young ruler. Tell me what I must do to be saved. Well, just keep the law. Well, I've been doing that since I was a child. Okay, go sell all your stuff. And he walks away sad. Okay, it's the same sort of thing that's going on here. He's saying to the lawyer, what needs to be done in order for you to be saved, you can't do. Okay, so the Good Samaritan is not, the parable of the Good Samaritan is not told so that we can go out and be like the Good Samaritan. In fact, we read that story and think that that's the point, but that's not it. Jesus wants us to be identified with the traveler in desperate need of help. We are the breathless bruised. We are the needy, unable to do anything to help ourselves. We are the broken people, beaten up by life, robbed of hope, except in our case, we aren't innocent travelers. We lie dying in a dirty ditch because we got ourselves into this mess. We are guilty, we are unclean. But then Jesus, the real Good Samaritan, he comes, and unlike the priest and Levite, he doesn't avoid us. He crosses the street from heaven to earth, comes into our mess. He gets his hands dirty at great cost to himself on the cross. He heals our wounds, he covers our nakedness, and he loves us with a no strings attached love. He brings us to the Father and promises that his help is not simply a one-time gift. It's a gift that will forever cover the charges that we continually incur. Jesus is the Good Samaritan in this story, not us. We are the ones who need the Good Samaritan. We are the ones who are lifeless, lying in a ditch, because of what we've done, because of the mess that we've made. Well, the law calls all of us unclean. All of us. And the only reason God can now call clean what the law has called unclean is because Jesus fulfilled the law for us. How can God call clean what the law has always called unclean? You see, all of our uncleanness was given to Jesus, and all of his cleanness was given to us. So no matter how hard we try, we will never, ever find happiness through self-approval. Ever. Which is what we try to do. We manufacture a romantic view of ourselves, to ourselves, so that we can survive, because there's no way we can survive if we actually believe to be true what is true about us. That we are far worse than we think we are. And so to go down the route of self-approval in order to find happiness and cleanness of conscience and those sorts of things is a dead end. We will, no matter how hard we try, we will never, ever find happiness. We will never experience cleanness through self-approval. We will only find happiness through God's approval. And because of Jesus, God looks at us and says, clean. He's clean. He's clean. You're clean because of what Jesus has done. I was listening to a sermon yesterday where the preacher rightfully said, if you ask most people inside the church, why are you going to heaven? Most people inside the church, in fact, this is what he said. He said, he's the pastor of a church, and he said that he has been doing the new members class at his church for 30 years. And as part of the process, one of the questions that he asks anyone who is becoming a new member is, if you were to die, which was a question born out of this church, by the way, if you, many, many years ago, if you were to die tonight and God were to say, why should I let you into heaven, what would you say? And he said, of the thousands and thousands of people who have answered that question, half give, sort of a non-Christian answer. Well, I think I've done good things, and I've gone to church my whole life, and I haven't really killed anybody, and I've tried to provide for my family, and, typical sort of non-Christian answer, my works. Okay, that's half. The other half say, because Jesus died on the cross for my sins. That's what the other half says. He says, not one time in 30 years has anyone said, God will let me into heaven because not only did Jesus take away my uncleanness on the cross and put it to death, but he gave me his cleanness. Okay? It's not just that God takes away our sin and our uncleanness, because if that's all he did, 2 seconds later we would begin getting unclean again. Okay, so it's not just he takes away like I've said, God is not the God of second chances. He's the God of one chance and a second Adam. Big difference between those two things. Okay, because a second chance is not good news to me. A third chance is not good news to me. I've blown it 10 trillion times. God can say, okay, I'm giving you another chance here. And we go, oh, that's amazing. I'll get it right this time. Okay, but we don't get it right this time. And so a God of second chances is not helpful to me. It's not encouraging to me. I don't find freedom by believing in a God of second chances. Rather, believing in a God of one chance and a second Adam. So it's not just God takes away our uncleanness, our unclean slate. If that's all he did, we'd begin screwing it up in 5 minutes from now. But he does more than that. He doesn't just take away our unclean slate. He gives us Jesus' clean slate, so that now when God relates to us, when God relates to you, and when God relates to me, he relates to us the way he relates to Jesus. This is my son, in whom I am well pleased. Because we now have inherited Christ's clean slate. And so we can say to one another, do not call unclean what God has called clean. In myself, I am only unclean. Horizontally, I am only unclean. In myself, I am only unclean. But because of what Jesus has done for me before God, I am only clean. God relates to me as one who is perfect because Christ was perfect for me.